Imagine yourself centuries ago, far before soft paper rolls were neatly stacked in bathrooms. Picture a world where comfort wasn't guaranteed, where necessity bred some of the strangest and most creative solutions you could ever imagine. Tonight, we re-stepping back into the hidden corners of history to uncover what people actually used instead of toilet paper. And along the way, we'll explore the daily lives challenges and customs of those who came long before us. From seashells to sponges, leaves to stones, and even inventions you might struggle to believe. This journey is on too just about hygiene. It asks about how human beings have always adapted to survive. Before we dive in, let me ask you a favor. If you find these deep dives into forgotten corners of the past relaxing, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It helps keep these stories alive and ensures I can continue making them for you. And I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below with what you're most curious about, or even share when and where you like to listen in. Are you winding down after a long day, listening in the stillness of the night, or putting this on to help you drift off to sleep? It's always amazing to see how far these stories reach. So settle into a comfortable spot, dim the lights, and let your imagination carry you back through time. Together, we'll move slowly through centuries of history, piece by piece, until the past feels vivid enough to touch. And who knows, you might find yourself dozing off somewhere between a Roman bathhouse and a medieval privy, letting the steady flow of history ease you into rest. Now, let's begin. Long before paper was ever thought of, before the comfort of soft fibers or folded rolls existed, human beings faced the same universal reality. After eating, drinking, and living, there would always be the matter of cleaning themselves. For the very first people, survival meant adapting to whatever the land around them offered. And hygiene, though far less refined than today, was still a necessity they could not ignore. Imagine a world tens of thousands of years ago, when our ancestors were nomadic hunters and gatherers, moving across landscapes that stretched endlessly with forests, rivers, deserts, and rocky cliffs. These early humans had no shops, no marketplaces, and certainly no notion of dedicated bathroom products. Instead, they turned to the most immediate, practical, and sometimes harsh tools of the earth itself: stones, sand, snow, and rough vegetation. Picture a fire fading at the center of a small encampment, the air filled with the scent of smoke, the stars glimmering above as families huddled close together. Life was simple, fragile, and everything was tied to the resources around them. In this world, after relieving themselves in the woods or on the open plains, people would use small, smooth stones or handfuls of sand to wipe themselves clean. Stones were plentiful, especially river-smooth pebbles or flat shards broken off from larger rocks. They were not chosen for comfort, but for necessity, and when handled carefully, they provided a means of scraping away waste. To us, this may sound unpleasant, even shocking, but to those first humans, it was simply part of life, no more unusual than drinking water from a stream or wrapping themselves in animal skins for warmth. Sand, too, became a natural ally, especially in desert regions where little else grew. Imagine crouching in the dry, golden heat of an endless expanse, reaching down to gather a handful of grit and using it as a cleanser. Sand could be abrasive, yes, but in its abundance, it offered both a cleaning agent and, in a sense, a primitive kind of exfoliation. It was also easily replaced, always just beneath one's feet, always ready. Some early people even saw sand as purifying, as it carried away filth and left behind the sense of being scoured clean by the earth itself. Snow was another tool, though less common, for those who lived in colder climates. To them, the icy chill may have been unpleasant, but the fresh whiteness of snow symbolized purity and renewal. Imagine stepping outside a shelter in the dead of winter, the world blanketed in silence and frost, and reaching for a handful of packed snow. The cold sting may have shocked the skin, yet it also offered a refreshing, almost cleansing sensation. Though it sounds primitive to us, snow was in fact one of the cleaner methods, as it carried no grit, no germs from the soil, and melted away immediately, leaving behind nothing but water. For those in regions where vegetation thrived, rough grasses, weeds, or bark may have been pressed into service. Early humans were endlessly adaptable, taking what the land gave and finding uses for every resource. Bark stripped from a tree might have been softened slightly by soaking in water, then used much like a natural scrub. Leaves could be gathered, though not all were pleasant. Imagine the trial and error of discovering which plants caused itching or burns. Through necessity, people learned quickly which plants were best avoided and which became reliable companions in daily routines. These methods might seem uncomfortable, but in the grand scheme of survival, comfort was not the priority. Cleanliness, though not understood in the scientific sense we know today, was still valued. Waste left clinging to the body brought smell, irritation, and perhaps even sickness. By necessity, early people understood that wiping was as much a part of living as eating or sleeping. Though they had no word for hygiene, their instinct for survival drove them to clean, and in doing so, they laid the groundwork for every method that followed. Over time, certain regions began favoring particular tools, shaped not by choice, but by environment. In rocky landscapes, smooth stones were easiest. In deserts, sand was always at hand. In snowy tundras, handfuls of frozen white flakes became the natural solution. And in forests or grasslands, leaves and bark were the most convenient. These choices were not luxuries. They were dictated by what the earth provided, and in this way, hygiene reflected the land itself. To study what people used is, in many ways, to study the geography of their world. It is easy to imagine the quiet discomfort of these methods, but it is also important to imagine the acceptance that came with them. Children grew up watching their parents do the same, learning from an early age that wiping with stone or sand was normal. There was no longing for paper, no thought that something better might exist. For countless generations, this was simply the way of life, ingrained into daily rhythms and passed down like any other skill of survival. Some archaeologists believe traces of these practices can even be seen in ancient settlements. Stones worn smooth in peculiar ways, or placed near areas thought to have been primitive latrines, may well have been the earliest tools of personal hygiene. These silent artifacts speak to a time when survival meant working with what was closest, when every resource had to serve multiple purposes, and when even something as humble as a pebble or a handful of earth became part of the daily cycle of life. As we linger on these earliest methods, it is worth remembering how ingenious human beings have always been. Faced with discomfort, they sought solutions. Faced with necessity, they created routines. What seems crude to us today was, for them, a stroke of practicality and adaptation. Every handful of sand, every smooth stone, every icy lump of snow was a small triumph of human resilience, a way of bending nature to meet the needs of the body. And so, in the quiet beginnings of this long story, we see the first chapter of human hygiene, not as an embarrassment, but as a testament to creativity. People survived because they learned to use what they had, to turn the simplest things into tools, and to accept discomfort when no better option existed. From these humble beginnings, the story of toilet paper unfolds, not as a sudden invention, but as a slow, winding journey through thousands of years of trial, error, and adaptation. In the stillness of that ancient world, as fires burned low and winds swept over plains or deserts, people wiped themselves with stones and sand, not thinking of the future, not knowing that one day, countless generations later, soft rolls of paper would be seen as essential. For them, survival was enough. For us, their story is a reminder of where comfort truly began. As people settled into different landscapes and grew more familiar with the rhythms of their environment, they began to see nature not only as a source of food and shelter, but also as a partner in the most ordinary aspects of daily life. Among the many resources that trees, shrubs, and plants offered, Leaves became one of the most practical, immediate, and surprisingly versatile tools for personal hygiene. Where stones and sand might feel rough and unyielding, leaves offered a softer alternative, something closer to the comforts we take for granted today. Imagine a forest stretching endlessly beneath the sun, the canopy alive with birdsong, and the air rich with the scent of earth and rain. In this world, leaves were always within reach, scattered across the ground or hanging low from branches. Their size, texture, and shape varied with the seasons. But for those who lived among them, this variety was not an obstacle, but a gift. A broad, pliant leaf could be gathered in moments, and for many communities, it quickly became the natural choice for wiping. Of course, not every leaf was suitable. Trial and error must have played a role in those early experiments, with people learning firsthand which plants cause rashes, irritation, or stinging discomfort. Some leaves, like those with fine hairs or toxic sap, would have made for painful lessons. Over time, knowledge grew passed down from elders to children, from one generation to the next, about which leaves were safe and reliable. In many cultures, this knowledge became a quiet but vital form of wisdom, as important as knowing which berries could be eaten or which roots could cure illness. Think for a moment about the sheer abundance of leaves in most regions of the world. They grow in countless shapes and textures, from the smooth, waxy surface of tropical plants to the broad, soft leaves of deciduous trees. Some provided not only a wipe, but also a sense of coolness, almost soothing to the skin. For people living in warm, humid climates, the refreshing touch of a damp leaf might have been welcome, a small comfort in a world that offered little luxury. For those in temperate zones, fallen leaves in autumn could be gathered in handfuls, dried by the air, but still pliable enough to serve their purpose. The choice of leaf often depended on local geography. In the American colonies centuries later, for example, farmers often turned to the large, thick leaves of corn plants, which grew tall and plentiful in their fields. The husks, too, could be put to use, though their texture was rougher. In Asia, banana leaves were favored in many regions for their broad, flexible, and smooth surfaces, offering both convenience and comfort. In Europe, plants like mullein, sometimes called cowboy toilet paper, were valued for their thick, velvety leaves, though they also carried the risk of irritation for the unwary. One can imagine the quiet rituals that grew around this practice. A person might step away from their home or camp, search the nearby brush for the right plant, and select a few leaves before relieving themselves. The process was simple, natural, and entirely in tune with the environment. In many ways, it reflected a harmony with the land, a recognition that everything needed for life, from food to shelter to hygiene, was already provided by nature. But leaves were not always used in isolation. Sometimes they were combined with water, especially in regions where streams and rivers flowed nearby. A dampened leaf could serve both as a wipe and as a primitive sponge, offering a cleaner result than a dry one. This blending of water and vegetation was perhaps one of the earliest steps toward the more elaborate cleansing rituals that would later emerge in different parts of the world. Cultural traditions also played a role. In some societies, particular plants held symbolic or even spiritual significance, and using their leaves for cleansing may have carried meaning beyond practicality. A plant considered purifying or sacred might have been chosen intentionally, not just for its softness, but for the belief that it helped ward off impurity. Though difficult to prove, it is not hard to imagine such connections forming, for early people often wove spiritual meaning into every aspect of life, seeing no sharp boundary between the physical and the sacred. Leaves also offered a renewable, biodegradable solution, something we now value in a world concerned with waste. In those ancient times, of course, this was not a conscious choice, but simply the way of things. When a leaf was used, it returned to the earth, decomposing naturally without leaving behind any trace. The cycle was seamless, a reminder of how closely human habits were once bound to nature's rhythms. For communities that farmed or cultivated the land, leaves were even more abundant. The fields that fed their families also provided the tools of hygiene, making every harvest a double gift. Corn cobs might be used in one context, but the leaves of the same plant served in another, showing how resourcefulness left nothing to waste. This practicality, born of necessity, reflects a mindset very different from ours today. Where we might think of products as single-use items, they thought of resources as endlessly adaptable, each with multiple purposes. In reflecting on this chapter of history, it becomes clear that leaves represented more than just convenience. They marked an early step toward comfort, a recognition that not all wiping methods had to be harsh or abrasive. Compared to stones or sand, a leaf was closer to what we now recognize as gentleness. For countless generations, this small improvement made daily life just a little easier, just a little more humane. And in a world where so much was uncertain and survival was never guaranteed, even small comforts mattered deeply. Imagine then the sound of wind rustling through trees, the smell of damp earth after rain, and the simple act of reaching for a broad leaf to wipe clean. It was an act so ordinary that no one thought much about it, yet it carried with it the quiet ingenuity of humanity adapting to the world around them. From this humble practice, a new layer of the long story of toilet paper begins to unfold, one that reveals not only what people used, but also how they learned to shape nature into something useful, comforting, and surprisingly thoughtful. As we leave the forests, fields, and gardens where leaves served as nature's toilet paper, we step forward into another realm of human ingenuity, the use of water itself, not just as a drink or for cooking, but as one of the oldest and most enduring methods of cleansing. For as long as human beings have lived beside rivers, streams, lakes, and seas, water has been more than a source of life. It has quenched thirst, cooked food, nourished crops, and washed away dirt from weary bodies. Yet beyond these obvious uses, water has also been one of the oldest and most enduring tools for cleansing after relieving oneself. While stones and leaves may have been temporary solutions, water offered something different, a sense of true renewal, of being washed clean rather than merely wiped. Imagine walking down to a river at dawn, the mist rising gently from its surface, the air cool and quiet, broken only by the ripple of flowing water. For early people, this setting was not just a place to drink or to bathe. It was also where the most intimate routines of daily life took place. To crouch by the bank, splash water upon oneself, and feel the current carry impurities away was both practical and comforting. It may have been cold at times, but it was effective, leaving behind not just cleanliness, but a sense of being refreshed. The use of water for cleansing is among the oldest hygienic practices known to humanity, and it still endures today in many cultures. In regions where water was abundant, it quickly became the preferred method. Across South Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Africa, the habit of washing with water after relieving oneself has been practiced for millennia. It became not just a matter of hygiene, but also a cultural expectation, woven into daily rituals and reinforced by spiritual teachings. In India, for example, water was regarded as a purifying element, capable of washing away not only physical dirt, but also symbolic impurity. The rivers themselves were often seen as sacred, and to cleanse with water was to participate in a cycle of renewal that stretched far beyond the physical body. In Islamic tradition, too, water became central to ritual purity, with specific practices prescribed for washing after using the toilet. These customs ensured that the use of water was not only widespread, but also deeply meaningful, passed down through centuries as a core part of life. Contrast this with regions where water was scarce, such as deserts or dry plains. There, people often relied on sand, stones, or other materials, because water could not be spared for such purposes. But in places where rivers flowed freely and rainfall was generous, water seemed the obvious choice. Its abundance made it accessible, and its cleansing power made it invaluable. Unlike leaves or bark, which might leave residue, or stones, which could be uncomfortable, water carried everything away entirely, leaving the body truly clean. Even in ancient Rome, where aqueducts and public baths showcased the importance of water in daily life, it played a role in hygiene after relieving oneself. The famous spongia, or sponge on a stick, was often rinsed in running water between uses. Though primitive by today's standards, it reflected the same principle, that water was the ultimate cleanser, washing away not only waste, but also discomfort. One of the quiet strengths of water as a method lies in its universality. Wherever people had access to it, they turned to it instinctively. The sensation of washing with water feels natural, almost obvious, in a way that wiping with rough materials does not. And so, across continents and centuries, water became not just a tool but a tradition. It survived the rise and fall of empires, the spread of new religions, and the invention of countless other wiping methods, because it was simple, effective, and rooted in the human desire for true cleanliness. Picture, for a moment, a villager in ancient Mesopotamia stepping down to the banks of the Tigris, scooping up water in a clay vessel and using it for washing. Or imagine a traveler along the Ganges, pausing to cleanse in the sacred river before continuing their journey. These acts were not grand, not ceremonial in the way we think of rituals, but they were part of life's steady rhythm, repeated daily and shared by countless others through the ages. There was also an element of practicality. In hot climates, washing with water after relieving oneself not only cleaned, but cooled the body. In communities where people bathed frequently, it was only natural that washing extended to this part of life as well. The act became so ingrained that it was often seen as the proper, even the only acceptable way to cleanse, with wiping considered insufficient. As time passed, the habit of using water was refined. In some cultures, small vessels were dedicated to the task clay pots, copper containers, or carved gourds designed to hold and pour water. These were simple tools, but they marked a shift from improvisation to intentional practice. Instead of merely stepping into a river, people could bring water to where it was needed, making the process more private and convenient. This adaptation shows how a basic practice gradually evolved into a structured part of daily life, laying the foundation for more modern devices like bidets or handheld sprayers. The enduring use of water also reveals something about human priorities. Comfort was important, but so was the feeling of thoroughness, of being genuinely clean. Wiping alone often left behind a sense of incompleteness, but water solved that problem entirely. For this reason, many who grew up with the practice have found it difficult to accept alternatives, even when moving to places where toilet paper is the norm. It speaks to the lasting impression that early habits leave, and to the simple power of water to satisfy a basic human need. Even today, billions of people continue to use water as their primary means of cleansing. Modern technology has only refined the process, from elaborate plumbing systems to sleek bathroom fixtures, but the principle remains unchanged. In many ways, it connects us directly to our ancestors, reminding us that across thousands of years, some solutions remain timeless. As we drift through this chapter of history, let us not imagine water only as a tool, but as a companion, always present, always reliable. From the snowmelt of mountains to the wide embrace of rivers, it has carried humanity through every stage of survival. And in those quiet moments of personal care, it has offered more than cleanliness. It has offered comfort, renewal, and even a sense of peace. From stones to leaves to water, each step in this long journey reveals the creativity and adaptability of human beings. Yet the story does not stop here. Beyond rivers and streams, people discovered stranger tools, still items we might never imagine being pressed into such service. As we turn the page, we find ourselves confronted with seashells, corn cobs, and a host of surprising choices that remind us just how inventive, and sometimes desperate, the human spirit can be. As people spread into new environments, their solutions to life's daily needs became as diverse as the landscapes they inhabited. Where forests offered leaves and rivers gave water, coasts and farmlands provided their own unique resources. Some of these choices might sound strange to us now, even a little humorous, yet to those who relied on them, they were practical and effective. Among the most surprising of these tools were seashells and corn cobs, both of which reveal just how creative human beings have always been when necessity required it. Imagine standing on the edge of a sunlit shore, the tide rolling gently in and out, scattering shells across the sand. For ancient coastal peoples, seashells were everywhere, polished by waves and waiting to be picked up. Smooth shells, in particular, became useful for scraping and wiping. Though not soft in the way we might expect from modern toilet paper, they had the advantage of being plentiful and easy to rinse clean in the sea. Archaeologists have even speculated that in some coastal settlements, piles of discarded shells may have included those used for such hygienic purposes. While we cannot say with certainty, the idea fits naturally with the way people throughout history turned whatever was nearby into tools for living. Shells varied in size and texture, and their usefulness depended on careful choice. A sharp edge could cut the skin, so people likely preferred flatter, smoother varieties. Think of scallop shells or rounded clam shells, their surfaces worn down by sand and salt water. Such shells, when handled carefully, could serve as a simple scraper. In the quiet rhythm of coastal life, they may have been as ordinary as the nets for fishing or the baskets for gathering seaweed. Far inland, away from the coasts, another unlikely material came into use: corn cobs. When maize became a staple crop in the Americas, its byproducts were put to work in countless ways. Farmers used husks for wrapping food, stalks for feeding animals, and, yes, cobs for hygiene. Once the kernels had been removed, the cob remained as a firm, fibrous cylinder that could be held in the hand and reused several times. To modern ears, this might sound rough, even harsh, but to people living centuries ago, it was a perfectly sensible solution. The cob's texture allowed for effective cleaning, and its abundance meant it was always available during harvest season. Corn cobs became particularly associated with rural communities, where practicality often outweighed comfort. In the wooden privies of colonial America, for instance, it was not unusual to find baskets of dried corn cobs set aside for use. This detail, passed down through stories and preserved in memory, paints a vivid picture of daily life. A simple outhouse, a cold breeze sneaking through the wooden slats, and a farmer reaching for a cob before heading back to his work. To those who lived it, the practice was unremarkable, just another part of life's cycle, as ordinary as milking cows or chopping wood. The ingenuity behind these tools speaks to a larger truth. Humans have always adapted their surroundings to meet their needs, even in the most private moments. Seashells and corn cobs may not have been luxurious, but they were effective, and effectiveness was often all that mattered. When comfort was a distant dream, survival and practicality ruled the day. Other surprising items found their place as well. In some regions, flat pieces of pottery or broken shards of clay were used in ways similar to shells. In areas with bamboo, thin slivers could be employed, though with care. Each of these choices might make us wince now, but for those who used them, they were simply solutions drawn from what was available. These methods remind us that history is filled not only with grand inventions and discoveries, but also with countless small acts of resourcefulness that kept daily life moving forward. The reliance on seashells and corn cobs also reveals the close relationship between hygiene and agriculture, between cleanliness and food production. What was eaten one day became the tool of hygiene the next. What washed up with the tide became not just decoration or tool for cooking, but an intimate part of life as routine. These practices, humble and often forgotten, tied people to the land and sea in ways we might easily overlook today. It is also important to remember that these methods were not used in isolation. A farmer who reached for a corn cob might also wash with water if it was available. A fisherman who wiped with a shell might rinse himself in the sea immediately afterward. The boundaries between wiping and washing were often blurred, shaped by environment, culture, and habit. In this way, seashells and corn cobs were not final solutions, but part of a larger pattern of improvisation and adaptation. To place yourself in the shoes of those who lived this reality, picture a late autumn day in the American countryside, the harvest completed, the fields bare and brown. In the corner of the barn, or by the outhouse door, sits a basket filled with clean, dried corn cobs, stacked neatly for use. No one thought to question the practice. It was simply the way things were done. Or imagine a coastal village, where children gather shells for play and adults collect the flatter ones to keep aside for practical needs. The act carried no shame, no hesitation, only the quiet acceptance that life's necessities demanded creativity. Though these tools may seem crude, they were stepping stones on the long path toward comfort. By making use of seashells and corn cobs, people demonstrated the same ingenuity that led eventually to more refined methods. They showed that even in the smallest details of life, human beings are problem solvers, finding answers in the most unexpected places. As we reflect on these surprising tools, it becomes easier to appreciate the everyday comforts we now take for granted. The softness of paper, the convenience of plumbing, the privacy of bathrooms, all of these were unimaginable luxuries to those who lived in earlier times. Their solutions might sound strange, but they remind us of the resilience and adaptability that have always defined humanity. From seashells polished by the sea to corn cobs gathered after harvest, these humble tools carried people through centuries of daily life. They are not merely curiosities, but important markers in the long history of human hygiene, proof that necessity can turn even the simplest objects into indispensable tools. And so, from the rocky shores to the fertile fields, we see once again how human beings shape their environment into solutions, no matter how unusual. Yet this story still has much further to go. Beyond seashells and corn cobs lay even stranger methods, some preserved in writing, others passed down through memory, and all of them waiting to remind us of the endless creativity of those who came before. As we turn to the next chapter, we leave the coastlines and the farmlands and journey into the world of ancient Greece, where hygiene was shaped not only by necessity, but also by philosophy, culture, and even politics. When we picture ancient Greece, our minds often drift to marble temples, philosophers debating beneath olive trees, or athletes competing beneath the blazing sun. Yet beneath the grandeur of Athens and the legends of Sparta, there existed the same daily necessities that connect us all through time. Among them was the question of hygiene. For the Greeks, the solution was often found not in leaves, not in water alone, but in an object that reflected both practicality and culture, small pieces of pottery known as ostraka. Ostraka were broken shards of ceramic, often from pots, vases, or amphorae that had cracked or worn out. In a society where pottery was used everywhere, from storing oil and wine to carrying water and grain, there was never a shortage of broken fragments. Instead of letting these shards go to waste, people found new uses for them. One such use, surprisingly enough, was as a tool for wiping after relieving oneself. To us, the thought might seem uncomfortable, even shocking. Pottery, after all, is hard and brittle. Yet in its time, ostraka served a very practical purpose. Their flat surfaces and angled edges allowed for scraping and wiping, and once used, they could be discarded easily, just as one might discard a shell or a stone. Archaeologists have found evidence of this practice in ancient texts and even in excavated remains, where piles of pottery shards suggest they were used in precisely this way. But ostraka were not merely practical. They also carried cultural weight. In Athens, these shards of pottery played a role in one of the city's most famous political practices, ostracism. Citizens would inscribe the names of individuals they wished to exile onto pieces of pottery, and if enough votes were cast, that person would be banished from Athens for a decade. The same shards that determined the fate of politicians and generals were also used for the most private of personal tasks. In this dual role, Astraka symbolized the intersection of the public and private in Greek life objects that bore both political power and everyday necessity. One can imagine the scene. A household in Athens, its storerooms filled with amphorae of oil and wine, some vessels cracked and no longer useful. Rather than waste them, the family breaks the pottery into smaller shards. Some are saved for writing, as Astraka often bore notes, lists, or names. Others are left for more practical uses, placed near the household latrine or simple outdoor pit. For the family, there was nothing strange about this practice. It was an efficient use of material, part of a culture that prized resourcefulness. The Greeks were also a people deeply concerned with cleanliness. Their love of bathing, their development of gymnasia with attached washing facilities, and their emphasis on personal grooming all speak to a society that valued hygiene highly. Using pottery shards may seem crude to us, but in the context of their time, it was consistent with their broader habits, thorough, practical, and shaped by what resources were readily at hand. In addition, Astraka could be rinsed and reused, especially if water was nearby. A shard dipped in a basin or scrubbed in a flowing stream could serve multiple times, though it is likely that many were simply discarded after a single use. Their durability made them easy to handle, and their abundance made them replaceable. Where leaves might wilt or shells might break, pottery fragments were plentiful and enduring. It is fascinating to consider how something so ordinary could carry both everyday and symbolic meaning. To wipe with a shard was one matter. To carve into it the name of a man destined for exile was another. Yet both acts remind us that Astraka were woven deeply into Greek life, bridging the most private and the most public aspects of existence. In one moment, they served as silent witnesses to democracy in action. In another, they were forgotten fragments of daily hygiene. This practice also highlights a theme that recurs throughout history: the human ability to repurpose the broken and the discarded. Where modern life often separates objects into single uses, ancient societies constantly reinvented what was around them. A cracked amphora did not mark the end of usefulness, but the beginning of a new chapter. It could be used as a container for ashes, as a shard for writing, or, in this case, as a tool of hygiene. In a world without abundance, nothing went to waste, not even the remnants of shattered clay. For the Greeks, the use of Astraka was not only practical, but in its own way, symbolic of their worldview. They lived in a society where ideas of purity, order, and renewal shaped daily practices. To cleanse oneself with pottery was to extend the same principles that governed their art, their politics, and their philosophy, that even the broken could serve a purpose, that even the discarded could hold meaning. It is easy to imagine a philosopher like Socrates or Aristotle reflecting, in some quiet moment, on the humble shard of pottery. To one man, it might serve as a tool for writing a lesson. To another, it could be used in a political vote. And to everyone, it was part of life's necessities, a reminder that even the loftiest thinkers lived within the same human realities as farmers, soldiers, and craftsmen. In this way, Astraka unite us across time, bringing the grand world of Greek civilization into contact with the simple needs that bind us all. When archaeologists uncover these shards today, inscribed with names or worn smooth by use, they offer us a direct connection to the hands that once held them. They tell stories not just of politics and exile, but of daily life stories of families, of private moments, of the unspoken habits that never found their way into epic poems or grand histories. These fragments, silent and unassuming, remind us that history is made not only of heroes and battles, but also of the small acts repeated countless times in every generation. As we drift further into this story, the ostraka of ancient Greece reveal a truth that carries through every culture we have explored. Human beings are endlessly inventive. They find solutions in the broken, the discarded, and the overlooked. They turn what might seem crude into something effective, and in doing so, they leave behind traces of their lives for us to rediscover centuries later. From the rocky coasts and farm fields of earlier chapters, we now step into the bustling streets of Athens, where shards of pottery shaped both democracy and daily hygiene. And as we leave Greece behind, our journey will carry us to Rome, where hygiene became not only a private act, but also a public one, woven into the grand architecture of baths and aqueducts, and where one of the most curious tools of all, the sponge on a stick, would become a defining feature of Roman life. When most of us think of ancient Rome, we picture grand marble buildings, chariots racing through crowded arenas, or legions marching with precision across the empire. But just as in Greece, life in Rome was not only about glory and power. It was also about the small, practical details that made daily living possible. Among these details was a practice that has fascinated and sometimes unsettled historians: the Roman use of sponges attached to sticks, known as the tursorium, for cleansing after relieving oneself. To understand this method, we must step into the Roman public latrine, a place that reveals much about how hygiene and social life were intertwined. These latrines were often large, open rooms with rows of stone benches, each punctuated by evenly spaced holes. Beneath the benches ran a channel of flowing water to carry away waste, and in front of them, another shallow channel of water for rinsing. Privacy, as we understand it today, did not exist. Instead, relieving oneself was a communal activity, carried out in the company of others, much like bathing in the public baths. It was in this environment that the tursorium played its role. Each sponge was affixed to the end of a stick, creating a tool that could be dipped into the channel of clean water, used for wiping, and then rinsed again. The idea was both practical and efficient. Instead of relying on disposable items like leaves or cloth, Romans created a reusable device, one that could serve multiple people over the course of a day. To us, this might sound unpleasant, but in the Roman mindset, was simply another part of the shared experience of urban life. The sponge itself was a natural sea sponge, prized for its absorbency and softness compared to harder materials like pottery or stone. Affixed securely to a wooden handle, it could reach where needed and then be cleaned with relative ease. Some accounts even suggest that sponges were stored in containers of vinegar or salt water between uses, both to disinfect and to reduce odors. While the effectiveness of such measures may be debated, they do show an awareness of cleanliness and an effort to maintain it in crowded conditions. Imagine sitting in one of these bustling latrines, the air filled with conversation as much as with less pleasant smells. Around you, citizens of every rank, merchants, soldiers, even senators, took part in the same routines. The tursorium was passed from one person to another, rinsed in the running water, and set aside for the next use. In its communal nature, this practice reflected the Roman worldview, where public life often overshadowed private. Just as baths were shared and meals enjoyed in groups, so too were the necessities of hygiene. The existence of such tools also points to Rome's advanced engineering. Aqueducts carried fresh water into cities, supplying fountains, baths, and latrines. The constant flow beneath the benches ensured that waste was carried away, reducing odors and improving sanitation compared to more primitive pits. In this setting, the tursorium was a logical solution, one that matched the infrastructure around it. Without running water, such a tool would have been less effective. But in Rome's urban centers, it fit neatly into the system of communal hygiene. Writers of the time occasionally referenced these practices, sometimes with humor. The Roman satirist Seneca once complained about the filth of public latrines, while others joked about the indignities of sharing such intimate tools. Yet their very presence in literature reminds us that these sponges were not obscure oddities, but well-known features of daily life. To the Roman mind, they were as ordinary as the baths or the marketplaces. It is also worth noting that the tersorium was not used everywhere. In rural areas, where elaborate latrines and constant water supplies were unavailable, people likely relied on simpler materials, leaves, moss, or even stones. The sponge on a stick was primarily an urban solution, made possible by the engineering marvels of Rome. It was in the cities, with their dense populations and complex infrastructure, that such tools became commonplace. As unusual as it may seem, the Romang method was in many ways ahead of its time. The idea of cleansing with a soft, absorbent material washed with water is not so different from the principles behind modern bidets or wet wipes. Though the communal aspect may put us off, the basic concept, a reusable tool, rinsed clean between uses, shows a concern for thoroughness that resonates even now. One can almost picture the daily rhythm. A Roman citizen rising in the morning, walking through crowded streets, pausing at a public latrine, and using the tersorium before heading to the baths or the forum. For him, there was no sense of shame, no secrecy. Hygiene was part of the shared life of the city, as ordinary as buying bread or debating politics. Archaeological evidence has helped confirm these practices. Excavations of Roman latrines have revealed channels for water, arrangements of stone benches, and even remnants of sponge-like materials. These findings bring the ancient descriptions to life, reminding us that what might sound bizarre today was once an everyday reality for millions of people across the empire. The story of the tersorium also teaches us something about how societies balance comfort, cleanliness, and community. The Romans valued efficiency and practicality, often at the expense of privacy. They were willing to share what we would consider intimate tools because the infrastructure around them supported it. The constant flow of water, the abundance of sponges, and the cultural acceptance of communal spaces made the practice sustainable for centuries. As we drift through this chapter of history, the sponge on a stick serves as a vivid reminder that human ingenuity often takes surprising forms. From stones and leaves to sponges and flowing water, each method reflects not only the resources available, but also the values of the society that used them. For Rome, the solution was communal, practical, and deeply tied to their remarkable achievements in engineering. When we consider our own habits today, with rolls of paper neatly stacked in bathrooms and an expectation of privacy, the Roman approach feels distant, almost alien. Yet beneath the differences, the same need remains: the search for cleanliness, for renewal, for a way to make daily life more bearable. The Romans found their answer in the tersorium, and for them, it worked. As we leave the stone benches of Roman latrines behind, our journey carries us eastward, into lands where water was not just practical but sacred. In India and the Middle East, hygiene became inseparable from spirituality, shaping practices that endure to this day. It is there that we find the next chapter in this long, winding story of how humanity met one of its most universal needs. Across the vast stretches of the Indian subcontinent and the deserts and cities of the Middle East, the act of cleansing oneself after using the toilet took on a significance that extended far beyond practicality. For these cultures, hygiene was not only about comfort or cleanliness, it was also deeply tied to ritual, spirituality, and a sense of purity. Where some civilizations had treated wiping as a simple necessity, in India and the Middle East it became a practice enshrined in tradition, shaped by belief and preserved across thousands of years. In India, water was central to nearly every aspect of life. Rivers were not merely natural resources, but sacred entities, worshipped as living deities. The Ganges, Yamuna, and countless smaller streams were believed to purify those who bathed in them, washing away both physical dirt and spiritual impurity. In such a world, it was only natural that water became the primary means of cleansing after relieving oneself. Wiping alone would have been seen as incomplete insufficient for true purification. To wash with water was to align oneself with the rhythms of nature and the expectations of religion. This practice was reinforced by Hindu teachings, which placed great emphasis on ritual purity. Cleanliness of the body was linked to the cleanliness of the soul, and acts of defilement, including relieving oneself, required cleansing to restore balance. From early childhood, people were taught to wash with water afterward, often using the left hand to assist in the process. This simple habit became deeply embedded in daily life, so much so that even today, across much of India, water remains the unquestioned method of cleansing. The left hand itself came to symbolize impurity in these cultures, precisely because it was associated with toileting. In contrast, the right hand was reserved for eating, greeting, and sacred tasks. This division of the body into roles, one clean and one unclean, shaped social customs, dining etiquette, and even gestures of respect. What may seem like a small detail was in fact a powerful force in structuring daily interactions and cultural norms. Across the Middle East, similar traditions emerged, shaped both by geography and by religion. Islam, which spread widely through the region, prescribed specific practices of cleanliness known as tahara. Among them was the obligation to wash oneself with water after relieving oneself, a practice called istinja. This requirement was not merely a suggestion but a duty, emphasized in religious texts and passed down as a core part of Muslim life. In many ways, it mirrored the Indian emphasis on water, showing how different cultures, separated by geography but united by environment and belief, arrived at similar solutions. In desert regions where water was precious, this obligation may have seemed challenging. Yet even there, ingenuity ensured that cleanliness remained a priority. Where flowing water was unavailable, people used small vessels, such as clay pots, to pour water for washing. In some cases, smooth stones or clumps of earth were employed when water could not be spared, though water was always considered the superior method whenever possible. The introduction of the lota, a small spouted vessel still used today in parts of South Asia and the Middle East, made washing easier, allowing individuals to carry water for personal use in a way that was both discreet and efficient. The use of water in these regions was more than hygiene. It was a spiritual act, a way of honoring the divine by maintaining purity. Before prayer, Muslims are required to perform ablutions, washing the hands, face, and feet. Cleansing after using the toilet was part of the same continuum, ensuring that the body was prepared for contact with God. In this way, something as ordinary as toileting became linked to the sacred rhythm of daily prayer, connecting the physical and the spiritual in a seamless cycle. Imagine, then, a small village in India centuries ago. A man rises before dawn, steps outside his home, and makes his way to a nearby stream. After relieving himself, he bends down, scooping water with his left hand to cleanse himself thoroughly. For him, this is not merely habit but duty, part of his devotion to keeping his body and spirit aligned. Or picture a woman in a desert town, carrying a clay vessel filled with water to a quiet corner. She uses it carefully, conserving every drop, but ensuring she is clean before returning to her family. These scenes, repeated countless times across centuries, show how hygiene was interwoven with faith, culture, and survival. What stands out about these practices is their continuity. While many other cultures shifted from one method to another, moving from stones to leaves to paper, the Indian and Middle Eastern emphasis on water has endured almost unchanged. Even today, in the modern world of plumbing and convenience, billions of people continue to wash with water rather than rely solely on paper. The introduction of bidets and handheld sprayers in bathrooms is, in many ways, a continuation of this ancient tradition, adapted for new technologies but rooted in timeless habits. This continuity also highlights the wisdom of these methods. Washing with water is, by most standards, more hygienic than wiping alone. It reduces the risk of irritation, prevents residue, and leaves the body feeling fresher. Though ancient people did not have microscopes or scientific understanding of germs, their instincts and traditions aligned with principles that modern science would later confirm. The rituals of hygiene in India and the Middle East also carried social significance. To neglect washing was to risk being seen as impure, unclean, or disrespectful. Cleanliness was a marker of discipline, devotion, and respectability. In this way, something as personal as toileting shaped how individuals were viewed by their communities. The act of washing reinforced social bonds, ensuring that everyone participated in the same expectations of purity. For those of us looking back, it is striking to see how these practices remind us of the deep connection between body and belief. Where some cultures treated wiping as a purely physical task, India and the Middle East elevated it into a spiritual one, embedding it in rituals that defined daily life. In their eyes, to cleanse the body was to honor the divine, to keep oneself worthy of prayer, community, and tradition. As we close this chapter, imagine the sound of flowing water from a sacred river, or the quiet trickle poured from a clay vessel in the desert night. These moments, intimate and private, carried meaning that stretched far beyond the individual. They were acts of survival, yes, but also of devotion, shaping entire cultures and leaving legacies that endure even today. From the sacred rivers of India to the sands of Arabia, water became not only a tool but a symbol, binding the physical act of cleansing to the spiritual act of renewal. And as history carried us further east, into the vast empire of China, water would give way to something new in invention that would eventually change the world and bring us closer to what we recognize today as toilet paper. If there is one place in the world that can claim to have truly reshaped the story of toilet paper, it is China. Long before the West imagined such luxuries, the Chinese were experimenting with paper, not only as a medium for writing, but also as a tool for the most practical needs of daily life. In their hands, what began as a refined invention for recording ideas and preserving history gradually found its way into households as something far more intimate. And in this transformation, we see how ingenuity can elevate even the simplest routines of human existence. Paper itself was invented in China during the Han Dynasty. Around the 2nd century BCE, though the exact details of its earliest forms remain a subject of debate among historians. It was made from mulberry bark, hemp, rags, and other plant fibers, pulped together and dried into thin sheets. At first, this new material was treasured for its ability to hold writing, replacing more cumbersome tools like bamboo slips or silk. But as production increased and paper became more common, its uses multiplied. By the 6th century CE, there are records suggesting that paper was being used for hygiene purposes, a practice unique to China at the time. One of the earliest written references to toilet paper appears in the year 589 CE, when an official from the Sui dynasty remarked that paper used for writing sacred texts should not be employed in toilets. His words imply, quite clearly, that other forms of paper were already being used for that very purpose. By the Tang dynasty, in the 8th century, toilet paper was not only acknowledged, but widely accepted. The idea that sheets of soft, disposable paper could serve this function marked a profound step forward in the long story of human hygiene. Imagine walking through a bustling Chinese city during this era, its markets filled with goods from across Asia, its scholars poring over scrolls of poetry, and its families living in homes where paper was part of daily life. For wealthier households, paper offered a cleaner, softer, and more refined alternative to leaves or cloth. It was easily cut or torn into squares, stacked neatly, and disposed of without fuss. What had once been the province of stones, shells, or sponges now became an act of gentle care, made possible by an invention that also carried the wisdom of philosophers and the brushstrokes of poets. By the 14th century, under the Yuan dynasty, the production of toilet paper had expanded dramatically. Historical records from that time described the manufacturing of hundreds of thousands of sheets each year in Zhejiang province, specifically intended for hygiene. These sheets were not small scraps, but often measured 2 feet by 3 feet large, thick, and specially prepared for comfort. This was no longer improvisation, but industry, a sign that the Chinese had elevated toilet paper from a curiosity to an established commodity. The contrast with other parts of the world at the time could not have been greater. In Europe, people still relied largely on rags, leaves, or their hands washed with water. In the Middle East and India, water remained the primary tool. Only in China had paper become integrated into the private routines of hygiene, showing how a single innovation could ripple outward into daily life in ways no one might have expected. Of course, the use of paper for hygiene was not universal within China. In rural areas, where resources were scarcer, people continued to use grass, bamboo, or water. But in cities and wealthy households, paper became increasingly common. Over time, it was refined to make it softer and less abrasive, moving closer to the texture we would recognize today. What had begun as sheets for writing and wrapping became sheets for wiping, transforming not just cleanliness, but comfort. The idea that paper could be used in this way might seem obvious to us, but it required a leap of imagination. Paper was, after all, a precious invention. To repurpose it for such humble needs required both abundance and practicality. It also required a cultural acceptance of paper as an everyday material, not just a sacred one. Once this shift occurred, the path was open for toilet paper to evolve into a staple of daily life. Think of a scholar in the Tang dynasty, seated in a quiet study, brush in hand, writing verses upon a smooth sheet of paper. That same material, in another context, might be folded neatly in a household for cleansing after a meal. In this dual role, paper reflected the breadth of human life, bridging the lofty and the ordinary, the sacred and the mundane. There is also something poetic in the idea that the same civilization that gave the world paper for recording ideas also gave it paper for wiping clean. It speaks to the holistic nature of human invention, where a single breakthrough can branch in countless directions, shaping not only culture and history, but also the simplest rhythms of the body. The Chinese saw no contradiction in this. To them, paper was versatile, adaptable, and ever useful. When European travelers later visited China, some marveled at this practice. Marco Polo, who journeyed through Asia in the 13th century, noted the Chinese use of paper for hygiene, describing it with a mixture of curiosity and amazement. For him, it was a detail that highlighted the sophistication and abundance of Chinese life, a sign that even in the most private matters, this society had found ways to improve comfort and cleanliness. As centuries passed, the Chinese continued to refine and produce toilet paper, though the idea would take much longer to spread to the rest of the world. It would not become common in Europe until the 19th century, when industrialization made paper cheap enough to manufacture for such purposes. In this sense, China was centuries ahead, enjoying a comfort that others would only later come to appreciate. To picture life in those times is to see families storing neat stacks of soft paper in their homes, using it daily, and discarding it without thought. What seems to us a simple convenience was, for them, a quiet revolution, a shift from harsh improvisation to gentle refinement. It was an early glimpse of the modern world, where even the smallest comforts are valued and produced on a large scale. From the riverbanks of India to the aqueducts of Rome, people had sought countless ways to cleanse themselves. But in China, the invention of paper created a new chapter, one that brought together practicality and luxury in equal measure. Here, in the heart of Asia, toilet paper was born not only as a tool of hygiene, but as a symbol of human ingenuity at its most adaptable. And so, as we leave the cities of China behind, with their bustling markets and neatly stacked sheets of paper, we move westward once again. The Middle Ages in Europe present a strikingly different picture, where comfort was rare, sanitation was poor, and the methods of wiping reflected a harsher, less forgiving world. It is there, among castles, peasants, and makeshift privies, that the next chapter of our story unfolds. When we imagine the Middle Ages, we often think of towering castles, armored knights, and bustling marketplaces. Yet behind the grandeur and hardship of medieval life lay the same private necessities that have followed humanity through every era. In a world where running water was rare, and paper was far too precious to be wasted on hygiene, people turned instead to a material that was both practical and familiar: cloth. From the lowest peasant to the wealthiest noble, scraps of fabric became one of the most common solutions for wiping in medieval Europe. Cloth, unlike leaves or stones, offered a softness and effectiveness that made it attractive. Households, whether rich or poor, often had leftover rags-old garments too worn to be mended, bits of linen or wool that no longer served their original purpose. Nothing in a medieval home went to waste, and even the smallest scrap might find a second life. In this case, those scraps were set aside for hygiene. The use of cloth was not glamorous, but it was dependable, a familiar resource repurposed for an unglamorous task. For peasants, cloth rags may have been used sparingly, for even the humblest fabric had value. They likely alternated with more natural options, like moss, straw, or handfuls of hay when cloth was scarce. In villages, privies were often simple wooden structures built over pits, with baskets or piles of rags nearby for wiping. Once used, these rags might be tossed aside, sometimes into the pit itself, sometimes washed and reused if fabric was limited. The decision depended on the household's means, their priorities, and their tolerance for discomfort. In wealthier households, the practice could be more refined. Nobles had greater access to fabric, especially softer materials like linen, which was prized for its texture. For them, wiping with cloth may have been one of the few comforts in a life that, despite wealth, still lacked many of the conveniences we take for granted today. Servants may have been tasked with laundering or discarding the soiled rags, keeping their masters supplied with fresh scraps. Though far removed from the delicate rolls of toilet paper that would come centuries later, this was, in its own way, a more luxurious approach than that of common villagers. The use of cloth also intersected with the medieval economy of waste and reuse. In a world where fabric was expensive and labor-intensive to produce, nothing was discarded lightly. Old garments were patched and repurposed until they could no longer be worn. At that point, they became cleaning cloths, stuffing for cushions, or, as in this case, toilet rags. This constant cycle of reuse reflects the frugality of medieval households, where every resource had to serve multiple purposes before it was truly discarded. Public latrines found in monasteries, castles, and some towns may also have employed cloth. Monks, living in close quarters, often shared facilities built over flowing water channels or deep cesspits. There, strips of cloth may have been provided for communal use, washed afterward by lay brothers or servants. Though records on these intimate details are scarce, the broader habits of monastic life emphasizing order, cleanliness, and communal living suggest that cloth, alongside water when possible, would have played a role. In some regions, moss and straw remained the more common tools, especially in rural areas where fabric was too valuable to spare. Moss, soft and absorbent, could be gathered in forests, while straw was plentiful after harvest. These natural materials were often used alongside cloth, depending on the season and availability. In this way, medieval people combined practicality with resourcefulness, ensuring that every part of the environment served their needs. It is tempting to imagine medieval hygiene as filthy and chaotic, but in truth, people of the time were more attentive to cleanliness than stereotypes suggest. While they lacked modern understanding of germs, they valued purity and took steps to avoid foulness where they could. Bathing, though less frequent than in Roman times, still played a role, especially in towns with public bathhouses. Washing hands before meals was common, and cloth rags for wiping were part of the same desire to remain clean, even within the limits of their world. The cloth approach also reminds us of the deep divide between rich and poor. For nobles, access to finer fabrics turned hygiene into a small luxury, while peasants often had to settle for rougher materials. Yet in both cases, the act of wiping with cloth reflects a universal truth. People sought comfort where they could find it, even in the most ordinary details of life. Whether with linen in a castle chamber or wool rags in a village outhouse, cloth offered a gentler alternative to harsher tools. There are even records of cloth being scented or softened for wealthier users, though such luxuries were rare. A noblewoman might have her servants prepare cloth with rosewater or herbal infusions, turning the mundane act of wiping into something faintly refined. For most, however, cloth was simply cloth plain, serviceable, and used without fuss. Imagine for a moment a medieval household on a winter's evening. The hearth burns low, the family gathered around for warmth. In a corner, a basket holds scraps of cloth, some used for cleaning dishes, others for wiping after visits to the wooden privy outside. To the family, this is no more remarkable than the tools hanging by the fireplace or the food stored in the larder. It is part of the quiet cycle of life, repeated day after day, season after season. The cloth approach carried forward into later centuries, persisting well into the early modern period. Even as paper became more widely available in Europe, it was far too costly to be wasted on hygiene. Cloth remained the reliable choice, especially in rural areas, until the industrial production of cheap paper finally offered an alternative. In this way, cloth bridged the gap between the ancient improvisations of stones and leaves and the modern convenience of toilet paper. Looking back, it is easy to see cloth as a step forward in comfort, even if it required laundering or disposal that we might find unpleasant today. It offered softness, absorbency, and familiarity, qualities that aligned more closely with what we now expect in hygiene. For medieval people, it was a practical and often preferred choice, one that fit neatly into the rhythms of their resourceful, frugal lives. And so, from the rags of peasants to the linens of nobles, cloth became a defining feature of hygiene in medieval Europe. It reminds us that history is not only about kings and battles, but also about the everyday ingenuity of ordinary people. In their scraps of fabric, we see both the limitations of their world and the creativity that allowed them to make do, to find comfort where they could, and to carry on through the challenges of life. As we leave behind the castles and villages of medieval Europe, our journey turns northward to lands where the cold seas shaped life in every detail. Among the Vikings, warriors and sailors who ventured far from home, hygiene took on new challenges, and their solutions reveal yet another layer in this long, winding story of human adaptability. When we think of the Vikings, we often imagine fierce warriors setting sail in dragon-headed ships, raiding distant coasts, or trading across vast seas. Their legends echo with tales of strength, exploration, and conquest. Yet behind the clamor of battle and the daring of voyages lay the same quiet routines that tied them to the rest of humanity. The Vikings, like every people before and after them, faced the daily matter of hygiene. And aboard their longships, in windswept settlements, or deep within northern forests, they developed their own ways of cleansing themselves when paper and cloth were not at hand. Life at sea demanded adaptation. A Viking ship was narrow, crowded, and exposed to the elements. Privacy was scarce, and resources were limited to whatever the crew carried or found along the way. For seafarers on long voyages, the most immediate tool for hygiene was the sea itself. After relieving themselves, sailors could wash with handfuls of seawater, leaning over the edge of the ship or using small wooden buckets lowered into the waves. Salt water, though rough on the skin, provided a ready and endless supply. The ocean became both their pathway and their cleanser, a constant companion of long weeks away from land. When ships anchored near shores, Vikings could also turn to nature's offerings. Seaweed, soft when wet and abundant along coastlines, was sometimes gathered and used as a wiping material. Its absorbent texture made it surprisingly effective, while its availability ensured it could be replaced easily. Imagine a crew pulling into a rocky bay, stepping ashore to gather armfuls of seaweed, not only for food or insulation, but also for this most basic of needs. To them, it was simply another use for a resource the sea had provided. On land, in their homes and settlements, the Vikings likely relied on more familiar natural tools. Moss was abundant in northern Europe, carpeting forests and bogs in thick, soft layers. Absorbent, pliable, and readily available, it became one of the most practical materials for hygiene. Families may have kept baskets of dried moss near their privies, using it not only for wiping, but also as stuffing for bedding or insulation for shoes. Moss, in many ways, was a universal tool of Viking life, serving countless purposes in their rugged environment. Straw and hay also played their part, especially in farming communities. After harvest, straw was plentiful, and though rougher than moss, it could still serve for wiping when nothing softer was available. Just as peasants in medieval Europe relied on straw, so too did the Vikings, turning the byproducts of their fields into tools of hygiene. It was not luxurious, but it was practical, and practicality often outweighed comfort in their world. Archaeological finds suggest that Viking latrines were often simple pits dug into the ground, sometimes lined with wood or stone. In larger settlements, waste was occasionally collected for use as fertilizer, a practice that made hygiene an important matter, not only for individuals, but for entire communities. Within these latrines, remnants of moss, straw, and other organic materials have been discovered, offering clues to how Vikings managed their needs. These traces, humble as they may seem, give us glimpses into the everyday lives of people who are often remembered only for their battles and voyages. Hygiene among the Vikings also carried social significance. Contrary to the stereotype of unwashed barbarians, evidence suggests they valued cleanliness highly. Combs, tweezers, and even small ear-cleaning tools have been found in Viking graves, indicating a culture attentive to grooming. Bathing, too, played a role. The Norse word for Saturday, laugardögr, means washing day, reflecting a weekly custom of bathing in hot springs or heated water. In such a culture, it is no surprise that wiping and cleansing after relieving oneself would also have been treated with care. Life on campaign or during long voyages posed greater challenges. Warriors far from home had to improvise with what was available. A patch of moss by a riverside, a handful of grass, or seawater scooped from the shore, all of these became tools of necessity. The Vikings were masters of adaptation, able to survive in harsh environments by using whatever nature provided. Their hygiene practices, like their seafaring skills, reflected this resourcefulness. Imagine a Viking longhouse in winter, snow piled high against the walls, the hearth blazing inside. Outside, a small latrine pit dug into the frozen ground, with moss or straw kept nearby in baskets. Children bundled in furs run past, while their parents go about daily tasks, none thinking twice about the humble materials that kept them clean. Or picture a crew aboard a longship, the sea spray stinging their faces, passing a wooden bucket of seawater to rinse themselves after relieving nature's call. These scenes remind us that even in the age of exploration and conquest, the quiet details of life carried on. The Vikings also lived in close contact with nature, and this relationship shaped their approach to hygiene. To them, there was no sharp divide between survival and ritual. The same moss that lined their boots kept them clean in the privy. The same seaweed that flavored their meals wiped their bodies. The same water that carried their ships washed them free of dirt. This seamless integration of resources into every aspect of life speaks to the adaptability and ingenuity of their culture. As with many ancient practices, these methods may seem uncomfortable to us now. Yet in the context of their world, they were not unusual. Moss, straw, seaweed, and seawater were simply what was available, and the Vikings made use of them with the same practicality that built ships, forged weapons, and sustained communities in harsh northern lands. Comfort was not the standard. Survival and functionality were. Looking back, it is easy to smile at the idea of a fierce Viking warrior, axe in hand, pausing to wipe with moss or rinse with seawater. Yet this image reminds us of the humanity behind the legends. No matter how far they traveled, how many battles they fought, or how grand their sagas became, they were still bound to the same daily routines as everyone else. In this way, the story of Viking hygiene grounds their mythic image in reality, connecting us to them not through conquest, but through the quiet rhythms of life. As we leave the longships and longhouses of the Vikings, our journey turns to other peoples across distant continents. While Europe found its solutions in cloth, straw, and moss, the indigenous peoples of the Americas discovered their own methods, shaped by forests, rivers, deserts, and plains. Their practices, diverse and deeply tied to the land, reveal yet another chapter in this long and fascinating story of how humanity met its most basic need. Long before Europeans arrived with their cloth rags, papers, and farming tools, the indigenous peoples of the Americas had already developed their own approaches to hygiene. These practices, varied and deeply rooted in the landscapes they inhabited, reflected the same ingenuity and adaptability we have seen across the world. From the icy regions of the north to the tropical jungles of the south, the indigenous peoples turned to nature, finding what was soft, absorbent, or cleansing, and making it part of their daily routines. In North America, many communities relied on materials that grew abundantly around them. Corn, which was cultivated across large regions, provided not only food, but also useful byproducts. Just as settlers later used corn cobs for wiping, so too did some indigenous groups find the fibrous remains of maize practical for hygiene. The husks and leaves could also be pressed into service, showing once again how every part of the crop found a purpose in daily life. In areas where corn was not grown, other plants offered their leaves, bark, or fibers, depending on what the local environment provided. Moss was another frequent companion, especially in forested or damp regions. Soft, absorbent, and plentiful, it served not only as bedding, insulation, and packing material, but also as a gentle tool for wiping. Families might gather moss in large quantities, drying some for later use and keeping it near their living spaces or simple latrines. The sensation of moss, compared to harsher materials like bark or stone, must have felt soft and comforting. For people who spent much of their time outdoors, moss provided a small but meaningful bit of relief. In the Arctic, Inuit communities faced an environment where plants were scarce. Here, snow became the primary tool of hygiene, serving as a cleanser after relieving oneself. While cold and bracing, snow was effective, leaving nothing behind and melting quickly. The Inuit, who had mastered survival in some of the harshest conditions on Earth, relied on snow not only for wiping, but for countless other needs, melting it for water, packing it for shelter, and shaping it into tools. In this frozen world, snow was not merely a resource, but a lifeline, and its role in hygiene was a natural extension of its central place in daily life. In Central and South America, where tropical forests stretched for miles and rivers flowed abundantly, leaves became the preferred choice. Large, broad leaves from banana plants or similar vegetation offered softness and size, making them ideal for wiping. Their smooth texture, coupled with the ease of gathering them, ensured they were a natural solution. Imagine a family living in the dense greenery of the Amazon, surrounded by plants of every shape and size. To them, selecting a leaf for wiping would have been as ordinary as gathering fruit for a meal or wood for a fire. The abundance of the environment meant that comfort was never far from reach. Water, too, played a role, particularly in regions where rivers and streams were plentiful. Just as in India and the Middle East, washing with water was often seen as more thorough and refreshing than wiping alone. Communities living along great rivers like the Mississippi or the Amazon could easily step into the water for cleansing. In warmer climates, this habit may have been especially welcome, offering both relief from the heat and a sense of renewal. The diversity of these practices across the Americas speaks to the diversity of the land itself. Each environment, whether frozen tundra, arid desert, open plain, or lush rainforest, shaped the choices of the people who lived there. Yet across all of them, the theme remained the same. Necessity drove creativity, and creativity ensured survival. What might seem unusual or uncomfortable to us today was, for them, simply part of life's rhythm, passed down through generations as naturally as language or song. Hygiene practices also reveal something of the broader values of indigenous life. Many communities lived in close relationship with the earth, viewing the land not as something to conquer, but as a partner in survival. To use moss, snow, leaves, or water for wiping was not merely practical, but also aligned with a worldview that saw every element of nature as interconnected. The same plants and waters that sustained life also cleansed it, creating a cycle that reinforced balance and respect. It is also worth noting that these practices were not rigid. People adapted constantly, shifting from one method to another as seasons change or as they traveled to new areas. A hunter on the plains might use grasses one day and snow the next. A family moving through forested lands might rely on moss in one place and broadleaves in another. This flexibility shows a remarkable resilience, the ability to live in harmony with whatever the land offered at any given moment. Picture, for a moment, an indigenous settlement in North America before the arrival of Europeans. Children play near the riverbank, while adults gather corn in the fields. Nearby, moss has been collected and stored, ready for use. A family moves quietly through the forest, the sound of leaves rustling underfoot, pausing to gather broad foliage, not just for shelter or cooking, but for hygiene. To them, these acts were ordinary, unremarkable, yet they reveal the ingenuity of a people who knew how to draw comfort from their environment. In the Andes, where high mountains made resources scarcer, communities likely turned to grasses or woven fibers, shaped into simple tools for wiping. In deserts, handfuls of sand might serve, much as they did in other dry regions of the world. Everywhere, the land dictated the method, and people listened, learning to live with what was given. For us, looking back, these practices might seem humble, even primitive. Yet they were effective, sustainable, and perfectly suited to the environments in which they arose. They remind us that comfort, as we understand it today, is only one way of living. For countless generations, people across the Americas found solutions that required no factories, no shops, no endless rolls of paper. Their methods were as natural as the land itself, dissolving back into the earth as soon as they were used. As Europeans arrived and colonization spread, many of these practices were disrupted, replaced by new tools and expectations. Yet the wisdom of indigenous hygiene endures, a reminder of how closely human life can be tied to the rhythms of nature. From moss and snow to leaves and water, the story of hygiene in the Americas is not just about survival, but about harmony, about seeing the world around you not as separate, but as an extension of yourself. And so, from the Arctic ice to the Amazon jungle, the indigenous peoples of the Americas reveal yet another chapter in this shared human story. As we leave their forests and rivers, our path takes us back to Europe, where castles and villages shaped daily life, and where hygiene often depended not on abundance, but on endurance. It is there, in the world of privies, cesspits, and castle walls, that our journey next unfolds. When we picture medieval Europe, it is often through the lens of romantic tales, knights riding in gleaming armor, ladies walking through castle courtyards, and peasants working diligently in the fields. Yet behind the walls of castles, and within the cottages of villages, there lay a far more ordinary reality, the need to relieve oneself, and the methods devised to make that possible. Unlike the flowing aqueducts of Rome or the neatly stacked papers of China, medieval Europe relied heavily on the humble privy, a solution both practical and imperfect, shaping the way people approached hygiene and waste. A privy was, at its core, a simple toilet, usually little more than a wooden seat placed over a pit dug into the ground. For peasants, these were often outdoor structures, small sheds built behind homes, sometimes shared among families or neighbors. The smell was unavoidable, the discomfort inevitable, but they served their purpose. In winter, the chill of entering a privy must have been sharp, while in summer, the buzzing of flies made it equally unpleasant. Yet for generations, these small wooden huts stood as the backbone of sanitation in rural life. Inside the privy, wiping materials varied by what was locally available. Moss, straw, and cloth rags were common, as we have seen. Sometimes handfuls of hay or even discarded wool served the same function. A basket or pile might be kept nearby, replenished as needed. For peasants who lived close to the land, there was little thought of luxury, only the practicality of what worked. Once used, scraps of cloth could be tossed into the pit, while straw or moss would decompose naturally along with the waste. In castles, privies took on a slightly different form, though they were far from glamorous. Known as garderobes, these were small rooms built into the walls, with stone or wooden seats opening into vertical shafts. Waste dropped down these shafts, often falling into a moat or cesspit below. The word garderobe itself hints at the dual role of such spaces, for clothing was sometimes hung there, the belief being that the foul smells would ward off moths and pests. To us, this seems unpleasant, but to them it was practical, a way of making use of every corner of their fortifications. The garderobe, though an improvement over the peasant's outdoor privy, was not without flaws. The shafts could clog, cesspits could overflow, and the stench could seep into castle walls. Servants were tasked with cleaning these spaces, an unpleasant duty that required removing waste by hand or carting it away for disposal. In some cases, waste was used as fertilizer, returned to the fields in a cycle of necessity. In others, it was simply dumped into nearby rivers or moats, contributing to the less than pristine conditions of medieval towns. For townsfolk, public latrines existed in some places, often maintained by guilds or municipalities. These were crude but necessary, especially in crowded urban environments where waste disposal was a constant challenge. Streams and rivers frequently served as open sewers, carrying away the refuse of thousands. In such conditions, wiping was often secondary to simply finding a place to relieve oneself. Cloth scraps, straw, or leaves might be used, but the greater concern was where the waste itself would go. Despite these challenges, hygiene mattered deeply to medieval people. Bathhouses, though fewer than in Roman times, still existed in many towns, and religious orders placed emphasis on cleanliness of body and spirit. Monasteries often built more advanced latrines, with channels of running water to carry waste away, echoing Roman practices in a simplified form. Monks might share long benches over these channels, their routines of wiping and washing integrated into a life of discipline and ritual. The experience of using a privy, whether in a peasant's cottage or a noble's castle, was rarely comfortable. Drafts of cold air, foul smells, and the ever-present risk of disease made it a dreaded necessity. Yet within these spaces, people carried out the same daily routines we know today, their tools shaped by the materials at hand. For a peasant, wiping with straw in a wooden shed was as normal as harvesting crops or mending clothing. For a noble, sitting in a stone garderobe and wiping with linen was part of the rhythm of castle life. Imagine the sounds and sensations. The creak of a wooden door opening to the privy, the muffled quiet inside, the scratch of straw, or the softness of cloth against the skin. Outside, life continued as normal, children playing, animals moving through fields, merchants shouting in markets. Inside, the user experienced a moment of solitude, brief and unremarkable, yet one that connected them to everyone around them. In this way, the privy was both a private and universal space, bridging all classes and communities. The challenges of waste management in medieval Europe also shaped the health of the time. Diseases like dysentery spread easily in crowded, unsanitary conditions, and the disposal of waste into rivers contributed to the cycle of illness. Yet within these limitations, people did what they could to maintain cleanliness. The cloths they used, the moss they gathered, and the privies they built all reflected an effort to cope with a world where comfort was scarce, but necessity unrelenting. Looking back, the medieval privy may seem crude, even primitive, compared to Roman aqueducts or Chinese paper. Yet it represents an important stage in the story of human hygiene. It shows how people living in a world of castles and fields found ways to manage the most basic needs with the tools they had. It also reminds us that history is not only about battles and kings, but about privies, garderobes, and the countless ordinary acts that sustained daily life. As we drift out of the shadow of stone castles and wooden huts, we turn next to the early modern world, where fabric, wool, and hemp scraps became more widespread, offering new variations on the cloth approach. Here, in the centuries leading toward industrialization, wiping practices would take yet another step forward, laying the groundwork for the comforts we know today. As Europe began to emerge from the Middle Ages and step into the early modern era, daily life was still shaped by frugality and practicality. Though great changes were underway, advances in trade, exploration of new lands, and the beginnings of science and industry, the routines of hygiene remained humble. Paper, though increasingly available for books, letters, and official records, was still far too expensive to be wasted on private matters. Instead, the people of this time continued to rely on scraps of fabric, wool, hemp, and other remnants of cloth that had reached the end of their usefulness. For centuries, fabric was one of the most valuable commodities in Europe. The labor required to spin, weave, and dye cloth meant that garments were cherished, patched, and repaired until they could no longer be worn. When a shirt or a gown grew too ragged to mend, it did not go to waste. It was cut into rags, stored in baskets, and given a second life as cleaning cloths, padding, or wiping material. In this way, wool and hemp, common textiles of the time, found their place not only in wardrobes, but also in privies. Wool, though coarse when woven into outer garments, could become softer in smaller scraps, especially if worn thin through years of use. These woolen rags provided a degree of comfort compared to straw or moss. Hemp, a durable fiber grown widely across Europe, also offered cloth that, once broken down through wear, could serve for hygiene. In households across the continent, piles of old fabric scraps were as ordinary as cooking pots or firewood, part of the cycle of reuse that governed everyday survival. In wealthier homes, linen rags may have been preferred. Linen, woven from flax, was smoother and gentler on the skin, and though expensive, its scraps eventually trickled down to be used in the privy. Nobles and merchants, with access to more clothing and finer materials, might have enjoyed greater comfort in this regard. Yet even among the wealthy, wiping was not a matter of luxury, but of practicality. The finest garments eventually wore thin, and their remnants served a purpose that no one spoke about openly, but everyone acknowledged silently. The reliance on cloth also connected hygiene to broader economic patterns. As trade expanded and textiles moved across continents, the fabrics used in daily life reflected global connections. Cotton, arriving from distant lands, began to supplement traditional fibers, though at first it was rare and costly. Wool and hemp remained the staples, grown and woven locally, shaping both clothing and hygiene in towns and villages alike. Public institutions, too, relied on cloth. Monasteries, hospitals, and even prisons often used scraps of fabric for their communal latrines. Servants or attendants collected, washed, or discarded them, ensuring a steady supply. In such settings, hygiene was not only a personal matter, but also a shared responsibility, overseen by those tasked with managing the practicalities of daily life. The use of cloth, humble though it was, provided a consistent solution in environments where other materials might have been scarce. In the countryside, peasants often combined cloth with other tools. Straw after harvest, moss from forests, or leaves in summer could supplement scarce rags. A family might reserve cloth scraps for the youngest or most vulnerable members, while adults relied on rougher alternatives when necessary. This layering of methods shows once again how adaptable people were, blending resources according to season, availability, and need. Imagine a small farmhouse in 17th century France. The family gathers for supper by candlelight, their clothes patched many times over. In a corner, a basket holds scraps of worn-out garments, a sleeve too frayed to mend, a strip cut from an old tunic. These rags will serve in the privy, tucked beside the wooden seat over the pit outside. No one considers it unusual, for this was the way things were done, passed down from parents to children, repeated across countless households in Europe and beyond. In cities where waste disposal was a constant problem, cloth rags were often tossed directly into cesspits or open sewers after use. The buildup of fabric, straw, and other refuse created challenges for those who maintained these pits, known as gong farmers in England. These workers, tasked with removing waste, sometimes complained about the sheer volume of cloth clogging the systems. Yet their labor was essential, keeping the cities functional despite their crowded conditions. The cloth approach also reflected the broader culture of thrift that defined early modern life. People lived with the awareness that every resource must be stretched to its limit. Nothing was truly disposable, for everything could serve again in another form. Clothing became rags, rags became wiping cloths, and even after that, they might be burned for fuel. This cycle of reuse kept households running, tying together survival and ingenuity in a world where abundance was rare. In some accounts, we even find references to cloth being shared within households, washed and reused multiple times. To us, this may sound unpleasant, but for families with few resources, it was simply necessity. Water, drawn from wells or streams, allowed cloth to be scrubbed and dried for another use. In this sense, the cloth approach combined both wiping and washing, a blend of methods that reflected both practicality and resilience. The early modern period also saw the gradual growth of printing, which would later introduce another unexpected resource for wiping: paper scraps, pamphlets, or old pages. But before printed paper became abundant enough for such uses, cloth remained dominant. It was the bridge between the harsher materials of the medieval world and the softer conveniences of modern times. Picture for a moment the contrast between a peasant family and a wealthy merchant household. In the peasant home, wiping meant coarse rags or straw, kept in baskets and shared among family members. In the merchant's home, finer linen rags, perhaps perfumed or softened, were used, collected by servants afterward. Both practices were quiet, unspoken parts of daily life, yet they reveal the layers of comfort and class that defined early modern society. Looking back, the reliance on wool, hemp, and fabric scraps may seem unremarkable. Yet it represents a key stage in the evolution of hygiene, a period where resourcefulness guided every choice. In these humble rags, we see both the limitations of the time and the creativity that kept people clean, healthy, and moving forward. They remind us that history is not only about invention, but also about adaptation, the endless reworking of materials to meet human needs. As we leave behind the rags of early modern Europe, our journey turns once more to the sea, where sailors faced unique challenges in maintaining hygiene during long voyages. Far from the comforts of home, with limited supplies and cramped quarters, they devised their own solutions. And in their story, we find yet another example of how necessity has always shaped the way people meet even the most private of needs. Life at sea has always carried a special kind of hardship. Sailors endured cramped quarters, unpredictable weather, and the endless expanse of ocean stretching in every direction. For weeks or months at a time, they lived without the comforts of land, dependent on whatever provisions had been stowed aboard before the voyage began. Among the many challenges they faced, hygiene was one of the most persistent, for the sea might carry them forward on their journeys, but it also stripped them of the simple conveniences that life on land provided. On a ship, space was precious. Food, water, weapons, and trade goods all competed for storage, leaving little room for luxuries. Toilet paper, even if it had been widely available, would not have been carried in large quantities, for it was bulky and unnecessary in the minds of sailors. Instead, they turned to the most abundant resource around them, the sea itself. After relieving themselves, many sailors simply rinsed with seawater, leaning over the ship's side or using a bucket lowered into the waves. The salt water, though harsh on the skin, offered an endless supply and required no storage. For those who wanted or needed something more tangible, rope ends or scraps of cloth often served the purpose. Sailors cut strips from worn-out sails, torn clothing, or spare rigging. These makeshift cloths, rough though they were, provided a tool for wiping before being tossed into the sea. In this way, every scrap aboard was pressed into service, for nothing could be wasted on long voyages. Old hemp ropes, frayed and soft from years of use, were sometimes employed in this way as well, cut down into smaller pieces that could be discarded after use. The design of ships also shaped hygiene practices. In smaller vessels, sailors relieved themselves over the side, crouching precariously against the rail, exposed to wind and waves. Larger ships, especially during the age of exploration, developed designated areas called heads, small platforms built at the bow where waste could be, deposited directly into the sea. These spaces, simple and open, gave sailors a place to tend to their needs, though they offered little privacy. For wiping, cloth scraps or seawater remained the norm, the rhythm of the waves serving as both cleansing and disposal. Imagine the scene: a sailor bracing himself against the rocking of the ship, gripping a rope with one hand as the sea sprays upward, and reaching for a rag with the other. The salt wind stings his face, the ship creaks beneath his feet, and around him life continues with the noise of men hauling sails or shouting orders. To him, this routine is unremarkable, a daily necessity as ordinary as eating a meal of salted fish or repairing a torn sail. Hygiene at sea was often a matter of endurance rather than comfort. Salt water could cause irritation, and cloth rags grew scarce on long voyages, leaving men to improvise with whatever they could find. In some accounts, sailors even used handfuls of sawdust or sand kept in barrels for scrubbing the decks, adapting the materials of their environment for personal needs. The harshness of these methods reflected the harshness of life aboard ship, where every aspect of survival demanded resilience. Disease was a constant threat in such conditions. Poor sanitation, coupled with limited fresh water and cramped quarters, meant that illnesses spread quickly. Dysentery, in particular, plagued crews, draining their strength and morale. The tools of wiping, whether seawater or rags, could not always prevent the spread of disease, but they reflected an effort to maintain some degree of cleanliness in an unforgiving environment. For sailors, these routines were part of the fragile balance that kept them alive through months at sea. The challenges of hygiene also highlight the differences between life aboard ship and life on land. A farmer might have access to moss, straw, or cloth, but a sailor had only the sea and the ship's supplies. The ingenuity of sailors turning rope ends into wiping cloths, using seawater in place of paper, or improvising with sand shows how necessity shaped every detail of their lives. These men were not just navigators and fighters, but problem solvers, finding ways to endure the endless days and nights on the ocean. Over time, as ships grew larger and voyages longer, more structured practices emerged. Naval fleets established rules for cleanliness, encouraging the use of seawater not only for wiping, but for bathing and washing clothes. Officers recognized that hygiene, however crude, was essential to discipline and health. Though sailors often resisted these routines, preferring to endure discomfort rather than follow orders, the effort to maintain cleanliness marked a step toward more organized maritime life. There are even records of sailors using communal sponges or cloths, rinsed in buckets of seawater, and passed from one man to another. To us, this may seem unpleasant, but in their world, it was a practical solution. No stranger than sharing a cramped bunk or eating from the same pot of stew. The sea was a communal space, and hygiene, like every other part of shipboard life, reflected that reality. Picture, then, a long voyage across the Atlantic during the 15th century. Weeks stretch into months, the horizon unbroken except by waves and sky. The sailors, weary and sunburned, performed the same tasks day after day, their routines punctuated by meals, watches, and the quiet visits to the ship's head. There, with nothing but salt water and scraps of cloth, they find a way to maintain a semblance of cleanliness, carrying on through discomfort with the endurance that defined their lives. Hygiene at sea was rarely discussed in logs or official records, for it was considered too ordinary, too unworthy of mention. Yet in these overlooked details, we glimpse the humanity of the men who braved the oceans. Their solutions, improvised and imperfect, remind us that history is not only about discoveries and battles, but also about the quiet persistence of sailors who endured the most basic struggles in the most extraordinary circumstances. As we leave the rolling decks of ships behind, our journey returns to land, where a new chapter of hygiene was beginning. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as printing spread and paper became cheaper, people discovered an unexpected resource for wiping: newspapers, pamphlets, and old pages. This shift marked the beginning of a transformation that would eventually lead to the toilet paper we know today. By the 18th century, the world was beginning to change in ways that touched even the smallest details of daily life. Printing presses churned out newspapers, pamphlets, and broadsheets in numbers never before seen. Literacy was spreading, ideas were moving faster, and the printed word was becoming a part of ordinary households. Yet in a curious twist of history, many of these papers, once read, found their way into the most private of spaces, not just as sources of knowledge, but as tools of hygiene. Before this period, paper was still considered precious. It was reserved for books, letters, contracts, and records, too costly to be wasted on such humble needs. But with the spread of printing in the 17th and 18th centuries, the balance shifted. Printers produced materials cheaply and in great volume, and households suddenly found themselves surrounded by scraps of paper that no longer had value once the news was outdated or the pamphlet discarded. In a world where nothing went to waste, these papers became an obvious resource. Imagine a farmhouse in colonial America, the family gathered around a hearth while a copy of the almanac rests on a shelf. Once its predictions of weather and planting seasons have passed, the pages may be torn out one by one, used in the privy outside. In towns and cities, newspapers delivered the latest political debates, shipping schedules, and gossip. After they were read, they were hung on nails beside the outhouse seat, ready to serve another purpose. What had once carried the news of the world now became part of the intimate routines of the household. In some cases, the very layout of these papers made them well suited for this second life. Almanacs and catalogs, for example, were printed on durable paper and bound with holes for hanging. Families often hung them on hooks inside privies, not only for reading during visits, but also for tearing away pages as needed. The Sears Roebuck catalog, which would arrive in the late 19th century, became a famous example of this practice. Its thick, glossy pages carried descriptions of goods for sale, but in rural America, it was valued just as highly for its use in the outhouse. This shift to printed paper marked an important transition in hygiene. Cloth rags, though still common, were not always pleasant to clean or reuse. Straw and moss were seasonal and sometimes rough. Printed paper, by contrast, was disposable, plentiful, and often free once its original purpose had been served. It represented a move toward convenience, a step closer to the modern expectation of single-use hygiene products. Of course, printed paper was not soft in the way we imagine toilet paper today. The ink could rub off, the texture could be coarse, and the edges could be stiff. Yet compared to many earlier methods, it was a small improvement. It was flat, absorbent, and easy to tear. For households used to improvising, it was a welcome addition, a sign that even humble scraps of paper could bring a little comfort. This practice was not limited to America. In Europe, newspapers and pamphlets were also repurposed in privies. Urban households, where printed materials were abundant, found it easy to keep a stack nearby. Rural families, too, valued the reuse of paper, saving scraps from packages or letters for the same purpose. In both settings, the growing flood of print culture ensured that paper was no longer a luxury, but an everyday material, ready to serve the most ordinary needs. The use of printed paper also reflected the growing culture of recycling and thrift in the 18th and 19th centuries. People found secondary uses for everything wood ashes fertilized gardens. Cloth became rags. Bones were boiled for glue. Paper, once red, became wrapping material, kindling for fires, or wiping sheets. Nothing was wasted, for every resource had value. There is even a certain poetry in the idea of newspapers serving this role. A sheet that once carried the speeches of politicians, the results of wars, or the latest fashions might end its life in the quiet privacy of an outhouse. The lofty words of kings and generals were reduced to scraps, used for the most unremarkable of purposes. In this, we see a kind of equality. Paper, regardless of its content, ultimately returned to the same cycle of use and disposal. By the 19th century, the practice of using printed paper had become so common that it was taken for granted. Travelers writing about life in rural America often remarked on the sight of newspapers or catalogs hanging in outhouses, a detail so ordinary to locals that it hardly merited mention. For them, it was simply the way things were done, part of the everyday resourcefulness that defined their lives. The growing reliance on printed paper also laid the groundwork for the eventual invention of commercial toilet paper. By the mid-19th century, manufacturers began to recognize that there was a market for a product designed specifically for hygiene, one that could improve on the roughness of newspapers and the inconvenience of rags. In this sense, the humble practice of reusing print was not merely a stopgap, but a stepping stone, preparing people to accept the idea of buying paper for such a purpose. Imagine, once more, a simple outhouse behind a farmhouse in the early 1800s. A wooden bench with a hole above a pit, the smell of hay drifting in from nearby fields, and a stack of old newspapers resting within arm's reach. A child might read a scrap of yesterday's headlines before tearing it away, while the father, having finished his morning routine, wipes with a page that once carried news of distant cities. To them, this is not strange, but perfectly natural, a practice repeated day after day across the countryside. This chapter of history reminds us that progress is often gradual, built from small steps and improvisations. The move from cloth and moss to printed paper was not dramatic, but it was significant. It marked a shift toward disposability, convenience, and comfort, values that would shape the modern world in countless ways. As the 19th century advanced, the world stood on the brink of industrialization, and with it came the invention of products designed not just for necessity, but for comfort itself. Among these was a new commodity commercial toilet paper packaged, marketed, and sold as a luxury that would soon become a necessity. With its arrival, the story of wiping entered a new era, one that connected centuries of improvisation to the conveniences of the modern age. By the mid-19th century, daily life in many parts of the world was being reshaped by industrialization. Machines clattered in factories, railroads stretched across continents, and mass production transformed how people lived. Even in the quietest corners of households, change was stirring. After centuries of relying on cloth scraps, moss, leaves, or newspapers, people were finally introduced to something new: toilet paper, made specifically for the purpose of personal hygiene. What had once been improvised from nature or repurposed from the printed page was now sold as a manufactured product, advertised as a cleaner, more comfortable alternative. The earliest forms of commercial toilet paper appeared in the United States. In 1857, a man named Joseph Gaetti marketed what he proudly called Gaetti's medicated paper. These were sheets of paper infused with aloe, packaged in boxes, and promoted as a healthful product for cleanliness. Unlike the newspapers and catalogs people were accustomed to using, Gaetti's paper was intended solely for toileting. It was a new idea, so new, in fact, that many people were uncertain about it. At first, it was seen more as a medical aid than an everyday necessity, something to soothe ailments rather than a tool for ordinary routines. Gaetti's venture marked an important step, but it was not until the later 19th century that toilet paper truly began to take hold. In 1879, a Scott Paper Company was founded, and within a decade it was selling toilet paper in rolls, much like the ones we know today. At first, the product was marketed quietly, almost discreetly, for speaking openly about bodily functions was considered improper. Packages often carried the names of local stores rather than the Scott brand itself, to spare customers embarrassment when making a purchase. Despite the hesitation, the advantages of commercial toilet paper gradually became clear. Unlike newspapers or catalogs, it was made to be soft, absorbent, and consistent. Unlike cloth scraps, it required no washing or disposal beyond use. And unlike straw or moss, it was always the same, free from the harshness of nature. For those who could afford it, toilet paper represented convenience, comfort, and a small but meaningful improvement in daily life. As production expanded, so too did the varieties offered. Some papers were plain, while others were medicated or scented. Packaging grew more elaborate, with advertisements highlighting not only cleanliness but also modernity. To use toilet paper was to participate in the progress of the age, to embrace the innovations that were transforming homes with gas lighting, plumbing, and factory-made goods. In this way, toilet paper became more than a product. It became a symbol of advancement, part of the march toward a modern lifestyle. Imagine the contrast in this era. In a rural farmhouse, a family might still hang newspapers in the outhouse, tearing away pages as needed. But in the home of a prosperous merchant in a growing city, a neat roll of toilet paper might sit beside a porcelain fixture, part of a new bathroom, designed with comfort in mind. These differences reflected not only wealth, but also geography, for the adoption of toilet paper spread unevenly, reaching urban areas before the countryside and wealthy households before the poor. The rise of indoor plumbing played a crucial role in the spread of toilet paper. As more homes installed flush toilets, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the need for a product that would not clog pipes became pressing. Cloth rags, straw, and even thick catalogs were impractical for plumbing systems. Toilet paper, designed to break down in water, was the perfect solution. Thus, the growth of toilet paper and the spread of modern bathrooms went hand in hand, each reinforcing the other. In Europe, the adoption of toilet paper came slightly later, but followed a similar path. At first, it was viewed as a luxury, used mainly by the wealthy. But as industrial production lowered costs, it became more accessible to ordinary households. By the early 20th century, toilet paper was spreading rapidly across Western nations, slowly replacing older methods. Still, cultural differences shaped its acceptance. In some parts of the world, particularly in regions where water had long been the preferred method of cleansing, toilet paper remained less essential. Even today, in many countries across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, water is still considered superior, and toilet paper is used sparingly or not at all. The spread of toilet paper, while vast, was never universal, reminding us that even modern conveniences are shaped by geography, culture, and tradition. Advertising played an important role in normalizing the product. Companies worked hard to overcome the embarrassment associated with discussing personal hygiene. Clever slogans emphasized softness, purity, and modern living, presenting toilet paper as not only practical but desirable. By the early 20th century, brands like Scott and Charmin had made toilet paper a household name, turning what was once an awkward subject into a symbol of comfort and refinement. Imagine a family at the dawn of the 20th century, gathered in a parlor lit by gas lamps, while in the next room, new bathroom gleams with porcelain fixtures. On a shelf beside the toilet, a roll of soft, white paper sits neatly, ready for use. For them, it is a small but significant improvement, a sign that life is changing, that modernity has entered even the most private corners of their home. The arrival of commercial toilet paper did not erase the old methods immediately. For decades, newspapers, catalogs, and cloth scraps continued to be used, especially in rural areas or among poorer households. But gradually, the convenience of manufactured rolls won out. By the mid-20th century, toilet paper was an expectation in much of the Western world, so common that it became invisible, a product people could not imagine living without. Looking back, the invention and spread of toilet paper might seem like a minor detail in history. Yet it reflects the same forces that shaped larger events: the growth of industry, the spread of commerce, the rise of modern advertising, and the changing expectations of comfort in daily life. It shows how even the smallest aspects of living are touched by the broader currents of history, how necessity and invention combined to transform routines that had once seemed unchanging. From the rough scraps of early modern rags to the neatly wrapped rolls of the Scott Paper Company, the journey of toilet paper reveals the long arc of human adaptation. It is a story of progress, not in battles or monuments, but in the quiet details of hygiene, where comfort slowly replaced hardship and convenience became a standard. As we leave behind the factories and advertisements of the 19th century, our journey turns to the 20th and beyond, where toilet paper became not only a household staple, but also a point of cultural difference, shaping habits and expectations across the globe. In this next chapter, we explore how diverse societies embraced or resisted the role of paper, and what these choices reveal about the meaning of cleanliness itself. Though commercial toilet paper had become a household staple in much of the Western world by the 20th century, it was far from a universal solution. The story of hygiene is not one of uniformity, but of diversity, shaped by geography, tradition, religion, and values that go far beyond convenience. Around the world, different societies developed and maintained their own ways of cleansing after relieving themselves. And in these differences, we see both the variety of human culture and the common thread of ingenuity. In much of Europe and North America, toilet paper quickly became the norm. By the early to mid-20th century, rolls of soft, perforated paper were available in every grocery store, packaged in ways that emphasized comfort and modern living. For many Western households, the idea of using anything else soon became unthinkable. The presence of toilet paper was tied closely to the spread of indoor plumbing, porcelain toilets, and the cultural emphasis on cleanliness as a marker of progress and respectability. Yet in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, long-standing traditions centered on water remain strong. In India, for example, The use of water for cleansing has endured for thousands of years. Small vessels, often made of brass, copper, or stainless steel, are still used for pouring water, while modern bathrooms may be equipped with handheld sprayers or bidet hoses. For many Indians, wiping alone with paper is considered insufficient, for true cleanliness is achieved only through washing. This belief is deeply tied to cultural and religious values that associate water with purity and renewal. In Muslim-majority countries, similar traditions are enshrined in daily practice. Islamic teachings emphasize cleanliness as part of spiritual discipline, with istinja washing with water after using the toilet considered a duty. Whether through simple pitchers, built-in water faucets, or handheld sprayers, the use of water remains the preferred method. In these societies, toilet paper may be present, but it is usually supplementary, used in combination with washing rather than as a replacement. Across East Asia, cultural habits vary. In Japan, for instance, toilet paper is widely used, but modern bathrooms often feature bidets or advanced toilets with built-in water spraying functions. These devices, now famous around the world, reflect a blending of Western influence with the traditional Asian emphasis on water cleansing. In this way, Japanese bathrooms embody both technological innovation and cultural continuity, offering comfort while honoring older practices. In parts of rural Africa, natural materials continue to play a role. Leaves, grass, or handfuls of sand may still be used, especially where paper is expensive or difficult to obtain. In some communities, water remains the primary method, with families fetching it from wells or rivers for multiple purposes, including hygiene. These practices are not signs of backwardness, but of practicality, shaped by environment and resources, just as in the earliest chapters of human history. South America, too, shows variation. In some regions, paper is widely used, especially in urban areas influenced by Western habits. Yet in rural areas, water or natural materials are still common. In places where plumbing is less developed, people often dispose of toilet paper separately rather than flushing it, a practice that reflects both infrastructure limitations and cultural norms. What emerges from these differences is a fascinating picture of how diverse societies define cleanliness. For some, it is the softness of paper. For others, the thoroughness of water. For some, it is the frugality of reusing cloth. For others, the abundance of disposable sheets. None of these methods is inherently superior, for each is suited to the environment, traditions, and values of the people who use it. Imagine for a moment walking through the streets of different cities around the world. In New York, grocery store shelves are stacked high with toilet paper rolls, their packaging bright and cheerful. In Delhi, homes keep metal water vessels near toilets, polished from years of use. In Istanbul, a public restroom features faucets for washing, built into the walls beside each stall. In Tokyo, a sleek electronic toilet hums softly, its buttons controlling streams of water at varying temperatures and pressures. Each setting feels ordinary to its people, yet extraordinary to outsiders, a reminder of how deeply culture shapes even the most private habits. The persistence of these differences also reveals something about human identity. Hygiene is not only practical, it is cultural, even symbolic. To wash with water or to wipe with paper is to align oneself with traditions passed down through generations. To change those habits is not simply a matter of adopting a new product, but of shifting cultural values, which often resist alteration. This is why, despite globalization and the spread of Western products, water remains dominant in much of the world, and toilet paper, though widespread, has not replaced it everywhere. Even in Western countries, cultural variation persists. In France and Italy, bidets became common fixtures in bathrooms during the 20th century, reflecting a continental preference for washing rather than wiping alone. In Northern Europe, particularly in Scandinavia, toilet paper is ubiquitous, but eco-conscious movements have begun encouraging the use of bidet sprayers or reusable cloth alternatives to reduce waste. In this way, culture continues to evolve, blending tradition with new values such as environmental sustainability. The COVID-19 pandemic of the early 21st century highlighted just how deeply ingrained these cultural differences remain. In Western countries, panic buying of toilet paper led to shortages and empty shelves, a clear sign of how essential people believed it to be. In countries where water was the norm, such shortages were far less concerning, for toilet paper was never central to hygiene in the first place. This global contrast underscored how habits that seem universal are, in fact, deeply cultural. Looking at these differences reminds us that history is not a straight line from rough stones to soft rolls of paper. It is a branching path, with each culture finding its own way, shaped by its environment, resources, and beliefs. What unites all these paths is the same human drive for cleanliness, comfort, and dignity. The methods differ, but the need is universal. As we reflect on this chapter, it becomes clear that toilet paper is only part of a much larger story, one that stretches across continents and centuries. Whether with water, leaves, cloth, or paper, humanity has always sought ways to meet this most ordinary need. And as we step into the modern age, with new inventions and new challenges, the story continues to evolve, reminding us that even in the smallest details of life, culture, history, and innovation are always intertwined. And so, as we leave behind the diversity of global practices, our journey moves to its final chapter, where we consider the modern innovations and the future of hygiene. In a world increasingly concerned with sustainability, comfort, and technology, what comes next may be as surprising to us as seashells, moss, or ostraka were to those who lived long ago. As we move into the modern age, the story of wiping and washing, of cloth and paper, of moss and seashells meets a new chapter 1 defined by technology, innovation, and questions about the future. For thousands of years, human beings made do with whatever nature provided. In the last 2 centuries, we learned to manufacture products specifically for comfort and convenience. Now, in the 21st century, the habits of hygiene are evolving once again, shaped by new values, sustainability, health, and the pursuit of ever greater ease. Toilet paper, once a luxury, became a staple in much of the world during the 20th century. Factories produced it in endless rolls, packaging it in bright wrappers, and delivering it to households everywhere. Brands competed on softness, thickness, and strength, promising clouds of comfort or quilted luxury. Yet as toilet paper became central to Western hygiene, its limitations also became apparent. Production required vast amounts of trees, water, and energy. Waste piled up in landfills. And in many countries, where water remained the preferred method, toilet paper never replaced older traditions. These realities opened the door to innovation, as inventors and companies sought to reimagine what hygiene could look like. One of the most significant modern developments has been the rise of bidets and bidet attachments. Long popular in Europe, particularly in France and Italy, bidets have in recent decades spread to other parts of the world, especially through electronic models, pioneered in Japan. These advanced toilets, equipped with heated seats, adjustable water jets, air dryers, and even music for privacy, transform the act of cleansing into an experience of comfort and technology. For many, they represent the ideal combination of tradition and innovation, the thoroughness of water cleansing paired with the convenience of modern plumbing. Japan, in particular, has become famous for these innovations. In countless homes and public restrooms, toilets hum softly with built-in controls, offering customized washing and drying functions. To sit on such a toilet is to experience a small marvel of engineering, a reminder of how far humanity has come from stones, moss, or corn cobs. Yet at the heart of the invention lies the same age-old desire to be clean, comfortable, and refreshed after relieving oneself. Elsewhere, Handheld bidet sprayers, sometimes called shattafs, have become increasingly common. Easy to install, inexpensive, and environmentally friendly, they allow people to wash directly with water, reducing reliance on paper. Their popularity has grown not only in Asia and the Middle East, where water has always been central, but also in Western countries, where interest in sustainability is encouraging more people to adopt them. Another modern innovation is the use of moist wipes. Sold in small packages and marketed for freshness, they offer a convenient alternative or supplement to toilet paper. While popular, they have also sparked debate, for many wipes contain plastics that do not break down easily, leading to clogged pipes and environmental problems. This tension between convenience and sustainability reflects a larger theme of modern hygiene, the struggle to balance comfort with responsibility. Looking toward the future, sustainability looms large. The production of toilet paper consumes millions of trees each year, along with enormous amounts of water and energy. As awareness of these costs grows, people are seeking alternatives. Recycled paper toilet rolls, bamboo-based products, and even reusable cloth wipes have emerged as eco-conscious options. Some households experiment with composting toilets, where waste and wiping materials are returned to the soil, closing the cycle that ancient peoples once took for granted. Technology may offer even greater changes. Engineers are developing self-cleaning toilets designed to minimize water use while maximizing hygiene. Some experiments explore air-based cleaning systems, using gentle streams of air in place of paper or water. Others envision entirely new approaches, where waste is broken down instantly by chemical or biological processes, eliminating the need for wiping altogether. Though still in their infancy, these ideas remind us that the story of hygiene is never static. It is always evolving, always adapting to the challenges of the age. Cultural shifts also shape the future. In Western countries, where toilet paper has long been dominant, more people are beginning to question its necessity. The shortages experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic exposed just how dependent societies had become on this single product. In contrast, countries that relied on water-based cleansing weathered the crisis with little disruption. This sparked conversations about resilience, sustainability, and whether habits long taken for granted might one day give way to new traditions. Imagine a bathroom of the future, sleek and minimalist, with a toilet that cleanses using a combination of water, air, and perhaps even light-based sterilization. No rolls of paper line the shelves, no waste bins overflow with soiled wipes. Instead, the process is seamless, hygienic, and environmentally sound. Such a vision may feel far removed from the present, but then again, so too would today's bathrooms to someone from the world of moss and straw. History teaches us that even the most ordinary routines can be transformed by invention. At the same time, it is important to remember that the future will not look the same everywhere. Just as cultural differences shaped hygiene in the past, they will continue to shape it in the years to come. Some societies will embrace advanced technology, while others will remain rooted in traditions of water or natural materials. Economic realities will play their role, as wealthier nations adopt innovations more quickly than poorer ones. In this way, the story of hygiene will remain diverse, reflecting the many paths humanity continues to walk. What unites all these possibilities is the same human need that has guided this story from the beginning: the desire for cleanliness, comfort, and dignity. Whether with a smooth stone, a sponge on a stick, a sheet of paper, or a jet of water, people have always sought to care for themselves in the aftermath of life's most ordinary necessity. That search will not end, for it is as much a part of survival as food or shelter. As we close this chapter, consider the long journey we have taken. From the earliest humans scraping with stones, to the leaves of forests, the sands of deserts, the snow of the Arctic, and the seashells of coastal villages. From the ostraka of Greece to the sponges of Rome, the cloth rags of medieval Europe, the moss of the Vikings, and the corn husks of the Americas. From the printed pages of newspapers to the soft rolls of commercial toilet paper, and now to bidets, sprayers, and visions of sustainable bathrooms of the future. It is a story not only of hygiene, but of ingenuity, resilience, and the endless creativity of the human spirit. And so, the future of toilet paper and its many alternatives is not fixed. It will continue to change, just as it always has, shaped by the challenges of the present and the possibilities of tomorrow. Whatever comes next, it will carry forward the same thread that has bound humanity for millennia, the simple, universal need to be clean, and the inventive ways we meet that need. As we reach the end of this long journey through time, from stones and seashells to paper rolls and high-tech bidets, one truth becomes clear. The story of hygiene is the story of humanity itself. Across every culture, every age, and every corner of the world, people have faced the same need and found countless ways to meet it. Some solutions were simple, born of necessity. Others were refined, born of invention. All of them reflect the same human drive to adapt, to survive, and to seek comfort even in life's smallest details. This history reminds us that progress is not only measured in monuments or inventions of grandeur, but also in the quiet tools of everyday life. A sponge on a stick in a Roman latrine, a handful of moss in a Viking longhouse, or a sheet of neatly packaged toilet paper in a modern bathroom. Each of these speaks to the same desire for cleanliness, dignity, and a sense of care. In these details, we see not only survival, but also resilience, resourcefulness, and even creativity. It also reminds us of our shared humanity. Though cultures differ, some preferring water, others paper, others natural materials, the need is universal. Everyone, from the humblest peasant to the most powerful king, from Arctic hunters to desert dwellers, faced the same task. In that sense, hygiene is the great equalizer, a reminder that no matter how vast the differences in wealth, power, or tradition, we are all bound by the same rhythms of life. Looking to the future, the story is still unfolding. New inventions will come, new values will shape habits, and what feels ordinary to us today may one day seem as strange as seashells or straw. Yet through it all, the thread of continuity will remain, the endless human search for comfort, health, and dignity. That search ties us to those who came before us and will link us to those who come after. So as you close your eyes tonight and drift into sleep, let these stories remind you of the ingenuity and persistence of humanity. Even in the smallest details of life, history holds lessons of creativity and resilience. Perhaps there is comfort in knowing that for thousands of years, people have met the same needs in countless ways, and through it all, life has gone on. If you've enjoyed this journey, I invite you to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future explorations into the forgotten corners of history. And I'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments what fascinated you most tonight, or when you usually listen in. Are you lying in bed, preparing to drift off, or listening quietly as the night deepens? Your stories bring this channel to life and remind us of the global community gathered here. For now, let the stories fade into the background like the gentle turning of pages or the soft flow of water. Let the long journey from ancient stones to modern paper carry you toward rest. Tomorrow, history will still be there, waiting to tell its tales. Tonight, though, may it guide you gently into dreams. Good night.